Well, howdy everybody, and welcome back to the farm. Today we're going to start something new, because that's what we do around here. We don't go back and finish other stuff that we started. We just start new stuff. When I get tired of this, we'll start new stuff later. And what is this new thing? Well, as usual, it's not really a new thing. It's something very, very old. And I've been talking about it all the time, all along. So what is this old thing? It's called the Bronze Age Collapse. And it started around 1200 BC, 3,200 years ago, roughly. The Bronze Age Collapse is a huge event that happened throughout the Mediterranean basin and Southwest Asia around 3,200 years ago. So we're talking about a time period that was considered ancient history, even to people like Julius Caesar. It's a little bit before my time. The classical period is generally considered to have started in 776 BC. So a little bit after 800 BC. And remember, with AD and BC dates, you have to think backwards. So 776 BC is 24 years after 800 BC. It starts to get really confusing when you're talking about the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Principate in the 1st century AD, because about half your dates are going to be BC dates that you got to think backwards about, and then the other half of the dates are AD dates that you have to think forwards about. I think most people don't realize that Western civilization completely fell apart, and everyone started trying to kill and destroy each other right around the year 1200 BC. And you would think that such a crazy event where brand new ethnicities show up, people just started migrating from one place to another, conquering new territory. Small bands of people rallied together to attack the great powers. Egypt was the main power at the time, and Egypt had to deal with a lot of these randos that were causing trouble. We'll talk about them and who they were. And it turns out that these people were very important, and they left some pretty cool stories. And you might be thinking, well, if the Bronze Age collapse was that consequential, then why don't we hear about it all the time? Wouldn't this have produced some sort of major work of literature or historical significance? We do have two very detailed and well-written, partially mythologized stories about some of the great events, the consequential things that happened during the Bronze Age collapse. The first source is called the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch. Pentateuch. And it's just an old Greek word for the 5 scrolls. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are mostly stories handed down to the Iron Age from the Bronze Age and from the chaotic period following the Bronze Age collapse. It took about 400 years for civilization to get back on track, with brand new players on the scene. So you can think of the years 1200 BC to about 800 BC as a 400-year gap in our history. Ancient historians end up having to just guess about what happened during that time. And we know that during this time, a lot of these oral stories about what happened during the Bronze Age collapse, and a little bit about why it may have happened. The stories about the great heroes of the Bronze Age were forgotten or distorted, amalgamated, embellished, exaggerated. But there was something really important about this 1200 BC date. And I think it's fitting to go ahead and talk about the Bronze Age collapse now because we have two movies that are coming out soon. The first one is Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. I had mentioned that there were multiple sources for this time period that relay some of the important events that occurred. And as I said before, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are a good source. In particular, the book of Exodus. The Exodus story happens during the Bronze Age collapse. So in this series on the Bronze Age collapse, we're going to talk about the Iliad and the Odyssey, Agamemnon and Odysseus and Achilles. But here's the weird thing. I don't think most people know that at the same time that Odysseus was wandering the Aegean, trying to get home, the people who followed Moses out of Egypt were wandering in the deserts of the Levant. In other words, the exodus and the finding and conquering of the territory that was promised to the Israelites by Yahweh. That occurred during this time too. So Achilles and Moses were more or less contemporaries. Obviously, there's no reason to think that they knew about each other at all. They came from very, very different worlds. I'm going to argue that Moses, or Moshe, was of a very complex or questionable ethnic origin, but most likely from the territory of Midian, which is on the Arabian Peninsula, but borders on the territories of ancient Egypt. And of course, some of you may be realizing that this subject is not completely unrelated to all the alien stuff. In other words, in my last volume on Meet the Aliens, we talked about cycles of civilizational resets, of cataclysms. Now, the year 1200 BC was not a civilizational reset. It was sort of a partial reset. There wasn't a complete forgetting of what occurred before, but it does show how quickly and easily civilization can be lost, how quickly information can be distorted or reinterpreted for a new era, and it loses some of the substance or the practical applications of the stories in the past. This 400 years does create a significant rift in the ancient world. When we think of ancient history, we normally think of the Iron Age. We normally think of the big marble temples, Zeus and Athena, and Jupiter, and Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, or Jesus of Nazareth. And they live in places like Jerusalem or Athens. That's the world we're more familiar with. But the Bronze Age collapse is the boundary between that familiar world and the Bronze Age, which is kinda unfamiliar. The religions were different. There were completely different ethnicities involved. So where the Iron Age is the world of Alexander and Caesar and Jews and Jesus, living in places like Jerusalem or Athens, by contrast, the Bronze Age is the world of Ozymandias and Achilles and Moses, living in places like Troy or Mycenae or Canaan or Midian or Egypt. The Bronze Age was ancient history to ancient people. Julius Caesar spoke about Odysseus and his era with reverence and a sense of distance, in the same way that Jesus spoke about Moses with the same kind of reverence and a sense of distance. Because by Jesus and Caesar's time, people like Odysseus and Moses had passed almost entirely into myth, but not completely. In this series, I am going to argue that Moses was absolutely a real person. The Exodus did happen, It's just that the details need to be examined. For example, some estimates say that nearly 1 million people were trying to migrate out of Egypt and move into what was called Canaan at the time. The Romans would later call it Palestine. But I'm going to argue that we're talking about maybe a few thousand people at most. And this is why there is no real archaeological record of their wandering in the desert. Also, probably because it wasn't an entire 30 years. Like I said, my theory is that over the course of 400 years of oral transmission of these ideas, the numbers got a little bit out of whack. And certain events that were actually separate events were lumped together, and the identities and motivations of some of the people involved were kind of boiled down, simplified, or just lost to history. So in a way, the Ten Commandments and the Odyssey are movies that take place in the same cinematic universe. I'll give you one example. In the 300s BC, much more recently, an ancient Greek geometer figured out a way to not only prove that the Earth was a sphere, but also get a good estimate of its circumference. And he got really close. However, during the Bronze Age, there was still the idea that maybe the Earth was flat. And as a result, in the early Old Testament and in the Homeric epics, you see a lot of references to the idea that the Earth has corners, or that it rests on pillars. And there's a world underneath this layer. And even the idea of a vault locking out water that is above the earth. These are very interesting ideas to our ears, but they were pretty common, especially in religious poetic scripts of the time. And not only are these two works linked by their clinging onto a flat earth cosmology, they also both involve fiercely enforced religious traditions that involve animal sacrifice. And both cultures are extremely warlike and despotic cultures that worship fairly vengeful deities. So, as I said, we're going to be looking at the Homeric epics. We're going to be looking at the Old Testament, especially Exodus. If you're talking Bronze Age, you have to check in with the Sumerians and what they may have written down on their cuneiform tablets. We also, of course, have to look at Egyptian records, and they're going to be our primary source for some of the most important information. Because, as I said, Egypt was one of the governments that survived, not in its existing form, but there was a continuity of information that we'll talk about. Some things were preserved in Egypt that had been lost multiple times elsewhere. But as we comb through these details, we have to stop and think, why should anybody care? Who cares? Okay, things fell apart around 1200. There was a lot of war, a lot of destruction, a lot of migration, a lot of wandering on the ocean, a lot of political systems falling apart, a lot of rebel leaders rising up and causing havoc. But, I mean, that happens a lot in history. So what? Well, it could provide good background for going to see Christopher Nolan's new movie, or especially Mel Gibson's new movie about the life of Jesus. And as you'll see, when Jesus has arguments with the established priests of Judaism at the time, when he argues with the Pharisees or the temple authorities, we see a major difference in how they look at Moses and how they interpret his law. Well, Moses existed and he got that law during the Bronze Age collapse. And the big political and cultural events of the Bronze Age collapse completely shaped who Moses was and what he was trying to do. So, in other words, I think that this is important for understanding our current culture and also understanding the history that brought us up to this point. And I think by studying this event and how this information was kind of lost to history over time and reinterpreted for new political goals, that might help us in the future when we start looking at other bits of old information. And this old, hard to decipher information might become a little more familiar to us. But we've got to get through some unfamiliar things first, because a lot of the major places and the characters involved in the Bronze Age collapse may be very unfamiliar to most people. Now, of course, I think most of us have heard about Achilles, or Moses, or Egyptian pharaohs like Ramses II. And I think we've heard of places like Athens or Mount Sinai or Sicily, which will be important in these stories. And I'm sure we've heard of Israelites and Trojans and Philistines. But after this series, they'll become even more familiar, and hopefully you'll be viewing them in a new, more complex light. Then we'll have some terms that will become familiar to us as we listen to the series. Terms like the Mycenaeans, or the Danaans, or the Ahioi, the Achaeans. Also groups like the Hittites, or the Hyksos, Hyksos. So yeah, a lot of weird terms, a lot of ethnicities that didn't really disappear, but they became lumped in with other ethnicities, and over time, intermarriage created a brand new ethnicity out of, say, 2 or 3 other ones. It happens. Ethnicities come and go. They're not permanent features of the human experience. Okay, now before we move on, we got to talk about AD and BC, and in particular, why I continue to use those initialisms and not the standard preferred terms of CE and BCE. For people who aren't aware of the recent changeover, starting around, I would say, the 1990s and definitely the 2000s, academic historians started to form a consensus that AD and BC just weren't good enough. They didn't cut it. They weren't modernized enough or culturally broad enough to be the standard dating system for the entire world. The idea was that it was strange for a Japanese historian or a historian of China, someone who worked on Chinese history, writing down dates that are based on medieval estimations of the year of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. They found that a little weird. And of course, my answer to them would be, tough. History is weird. Get over it. But instead, people decided to change AD and BC to CE and BCE. So what do all these letters actually mean? Well, I think we all know that BC means before Christ, and these are years counted back from the year of Jesus' birth, which was generally considered to be December 25th of year 1 AD. There was no year 0. We went directly from 1 BC to 1 AD, and for most of 1 AD, Jesus was not born yet. That is an early Catholic Church tradition, and there needs to be a little bit of wiggle room applied to that, because it appears that Jesus of Nazareth was born in 4, 5, or 6 BC. So Jesus of Nazareth was born around 4 BC, which is a strange thing to say. He was born 4 years before scholars 500 years later would think he was born. 4 years is pretty good, I think, when you're using ancient records in the early Dark Ages to find the year of birth of some foreign person that the Romans would not have kept any good records on. It was a lot of detective work, and I think they did a great job. And it wasn't just anchoring the years down to this one event. Of course, the Julian and then the Gregorian calendars actually work really well. They are very practically useful ways of counting time. So it's not really the nod to the Christian belief system, but the fact that it works well. It's convenient to use to keep track of when things happened year after year. All the weirdness about the different lengths of months and leap years are necessary for astronomical reasons. That's defined by the motions of objects in the heavens, not by Christian doctrine. So, long story short, aside from the choice of the anchor date, the birth of Jesus, it's not a very inherently Christian system. And you got to pick some date. The Romans tried to count down from the founding of Rome by Romulus in 753 BC. And, that was kind of convenient. That worked. Unfortunately, that wasn't always used. The Romans tended to reckon things by the year of the rule of a particular emperor. That would be like, instead of me saying I was born in 1975, I would have to say, I was born in the 3rd year of the reign of Gerald Ford. That would be confusing. Or my wife was born in the 1st year of the reign of Jimmy Carter. So enough about BC. What does AD mean? I think we've all heard the childhood rumor that it means after death. But remember, the division between BC and AD is not the crucifixion, but rather just the birth of Jesus. So Jesus was born in 1 AD, so that couldn't mean after death. And as we all know, AD stands for Anno Domini. Anno is one of those characteristically weird Latin words that has an English preposition built into it. So because of the way it ends, it's a form of the Latin word annus, A-N-N-U-S, annus, which means a year. Now, you got to be careful with how long you make your N sound there, because A-N-U-S, as we all know, is a very different word in Latin. So, it's not Anno Domini, it's Anno Domini. And that long O at the end means we're talking about something in that year. And what year are we talking about? Well, the year of the Lord. Dominus would mean the Lord. Remember, there's no the in Latin. So Dominus is the Lord. And Domini, when you take the us off and change it to a long E sound, in that case, it means of the Lord. So Dominus means the Lord. Domini means of the Lord. I've heard some people say in the year of our Lord, but there is no our specified in the phrase. Now let's look at the replacements, CE and BCE. CE stands for the Common Era, the era we all know about. And then BCE stands for before the Common Era, before the era that we all refer to. Now, I think this is inefficient, dishonest, and it's really just a kind of euphemism, because we all know what the Common Era means. We all know what this number is counting from. And BCE adds a new letter. It's not even more efficient. Now it takes longer to say a date. Now, to me, that's going backwards. Things are supposed to be more succinct and efficient as we learn more and more about our history. So I wanted to make this clear because I think a lot of people think that I use AD and BC because of either ignorance of how high-level academic history is written, or just I got my degree way too early. But no, it was very much in effect. And when I was a professional freelance editor who worked mostly on academic papers from the graduate level on up, I would help prepare papers for publication in journals, and I routinely changed BC to BCE, but I did that because that's the rule. That's how the style guides want it, and it was my job to make everything conform to the style guide in question. So I think the thinking is that a lot of people might have the following thought. Well, gosh, I think it's unfair that I have to use the letters A and D after my years because I don't believe Jesus of Nazareth is an actual Christ. I don't believe in the idea of a Christ, and I don't think he's my Lord, so I shouldn't have to use AD on my years. Well, I mean, that makes logical sense, but let me provide you with another statement that I think is exactly as sound, that I think would inevitably result from applying that logic to other things in life. So how about this? I refuse to use the word Thursday. Why? Because I'm not a Norseman. I don't believe in Thor. It's Thor's Day. It comes from Norse mythology. So I am not going to use Thursday. I'm going to call it Fourth Weekday, where Monday is the first weekday. And I know calling Saturday sixth weekday is a terrible idea, and it sounds terrible, and it's a mouthful, but we'll have to call it that because Saturday comes from Saturn's day. It's the day dedicated to this disgusting Roman pagan god called Saturn. So come on, guys. Let's stop using these days of the week names because they're all pagan. They're all polluted with pagan ideas. So I think you can see my point. I think that's going way too far. And it's also just not accepting history. It's just one of those accidents of history that the Gregorian calendar caught on so well. It's not current Christianity's fault that the early Christian church came up with a really good calendar, and they used a single obvious anchor point to count from, which made it very useful and convenient for referencing time between cultures and across long spans of time. If we want to go farther with this logic, let's find out who decided that in the United States we were going to drive on the right side of the road. Who decided that red lights mean that you have to stop and green lights mean go? What if the person who decided that was racist? What if they decided that we would drive on the right in America because Americans were always right? What if he decided that red means stop because Native American people are evil, and that whenever you see red, you got to be careful because you never know when you're going to be attacked by savages? So let's imagine that our traffic rules come from controversial historical ideas like that. Well, who cares? If we were to say we were going to suddenly start driving on the left side of the road and start stopping at green lights and flying through red lights because we don't like the politics or the belief system of the person who created the road system, and you're thinking to yourself, man, every time I stop at a red light, I just can't get over the ugliness of the idea that Native Americans are dangerous. You see my point. It very quickly gets petty, impractical, and it kind of feels like an attempt to erase history. I think that continuing to use AD and BC is an important reminder that you can't understand Western history from about 300 AD forward without understanding at least the basics of Christianity. And unfortunately, understanding, quote unquote, the basics of Christianity is still difficult because Christianity is objectively the most complex of the major world religions. So enough about AD and BC. Just know that I don't think that using AD is any more inherently Christian than using the word Thursday or Saturday makes you pagan. So back to the Bronze Age collapse. Back to 1200 BC, 1200 years before the birth of Christ. And during this 50-year span of time, and it was just 50 years, it was a sudden breakdown of the economy, a sudden explosion of violence and political chaos, and it appears to have all occurred between 1200 BC and 1150 BC. And what had happened was, before 1200, all the way back to, say, 6000 BC, early human civilization was humming along. You had urbanized, state-level societies in places like Sumer or Egypt. But we have to remember, during this time, during this Bronze Age, there weren't any real Greeks. There was an early form of the Greek language that was being spoken, but the cultural identity that we know of as ancient Greek did not come around until after 800 BC. That identity slowly formed during the 400 years of chaos after the Bronze Age collapse. But there was a civilization in the place that we think of as Greece, the islands of the Aegean in particular, and what's now modern Turkey. But since the Turks didn't exist back then, and no Turks had even set foot in what's now Turkey, it was called Anatolia, also called Asia Minor. So in Egypt and the Aegean, the island of Crete, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, in those areas you had very sophisticated Bronze Age societies that traded with each other, occasionally went to war, but they seem to have kept things under control for the first few thousand years of human civilization. But then something happened around 1200 that made everybody go nuts. And every state-level society, every urban center, suddenly went on the defensive. Unfortunately, it looks like the majority of what happened and what the causes of these events were was not remembered and wasn't written down. We have scraps to thumb through to try to figure out what happened. But these grand old nation-states that started human civilization in the West suddenly fell apart. And archaeologists have provided a very frightening and conclusive image about what this time period was like, because they can show that almost every single major urban center was destroyed during this time, reduced to ash, and whoever was left slowly started over to rebuild on the ruins. So, for example, archaeologists can show that between 1200 and 1150 BC, almost every city center in Anatolia and in what's now the Holy Land, or the Levant, meaning Israel, Palestine, or what used to be called Canaan, and also Lebanon, those regions were completely laid waste in some sort of deliberate military attack. So you had really powerful states like the Minoans or the Mycenaeans, or powerful city-states like Troy, and then massive empires like the Hittites or the Egyptians. But then from 1200 to 1150, you had a lot of horrible stuff going on, and things got so bad that humans did not really start trying to reach out to other humans to form trade networks, or to exchange cultural information, or to build new city centers, or start writing down oral traditions people didn't start doing that until around 800 BC. So almost 400 years of illiterate confusion, of political darkness, of military raids, and constant disruption. And also, the thing I'm going to talk about the most, which is the ethnic and cultural turmoil. I think we're all used to the idea that an ancient city could get really powerful and rich, and then a bunch of other people would band together to lay siege to the city and destroy it and take all its stuff. I think we've all heard that. What we haven't heard a lot about are the cultural issues. We had old religions that were taken down and replaced with new ones. We had entire ethnic groups, social identities that were wiped out and reconstituted into new ones. For example, we'll find out that what we think of as the Israelites, who would later become the Jews, were actually originally an amalgam of other older ethnic groups from the Bronze Age, and that this identity that we call Israelite was formed between 1200 and 1150 BC. So the ethnicity that we call the Israelites, later the Jews, the ethnic group that we refer to as Greek, and the ethnic group that we refer to as Latin, in other words, the ethnic group that founded Rome, these groups formed out of the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. They are products of that turmoil and the forging of new cultural identities and even new religious beliefs. And in general, I think it's interesting that all of these new ethnic groups, when it came time to sit down and remember the distant past, when it came time to write down the traditions that had been handed down orally through their ancestors, they all seem to have very clear traditions and cultural memories of a time when humans lived a lot longer and grew larger. Now, some people might say, well, they're remembering actual giants. They're remembering these things that lived for 1,000 years and grew to be 10 feet tall. Well, not necessarily. I think that scattered, destitute people in the early Iron Age, who were deprived of the economic vibrance and abundance of the late Bronze Age, would look at these old, well-fed warlords that culture could produce and maintain. They might look at that and say, gosh, well, those were giants, and they had some sort of grip on mortality that allowed them to live longer. Well, it may have just been better sanitation and better food. We normally think of history being progressive. Things get better. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. The life expectancy and the quality of life of the average person living in the Eastern Mediterranean in, say, 13 or 1400 BC would be significantly better than someone living in 900 BC in the same area. And so we've got 500 years of regression, things getting worse, less food, less literacy, less trade, less travel, more warfare, more piracy. And when you have city centers that are contracting, people who are on the defensive, they're not clearing new fields, they're not building new walls, and so you have a general drifting backwards into what their ancestors would have referred to as barbarism and backwardness. Odysseus would have been disappointed and confused with what his descendants had become by, say, about 1000 BC. He would have said, how did we fall so far in just a few hundred years? How did we become scattered bands of ignorant people who once had proud ancestors who were essentially gigantic comic book heroes to their descendants. Heavily mythologized figures like Achilles or Moses, who were mythologized precisely because they represented a culture that was so far advanced over the one that was writing down what happened. And so you could see that they had a reverence for the past because they saw, even back then, that technology and culture and history had gone backwards. Humans had regressed. And this may have set the entire ancient world on this weird idea that they had that humans were getting worse over time. The Romans believed in the exact opposite of progress. They thought that ancient humans figured out the best way to live thousands of years ago, and humans are just sort of now a shadow of their former selves, trying to figure out how to live life well again. That is pretty much the exact opposite of what I think a lot of people in Western civilization think now. We tend to think now that the more recent the idea is, the more likely it is to be accurate. But ancient people saw it the other way. In the Greco-Roman world, or let's go ahead and say in the Roman world, the older the idea, the better. Okay, so let's talk about the players. Let's talk about the chess pieces that were on the board in 1200 BC. In other words, let's look at what was about to fall. Let's look at how nice things were there for a while. And to understand who Achilles or Odysseus really were, we'll have to talk about Mycenaean civilization and, to some extent, the Minoan civilization of Crete. We'll look at archaeological findings about very ancient Athens. And then we'll talk about Troy, what archaeologists have discovered about the real Troy that existed during this period. And then to find out more about who the Israelites really were, and who Moses may have been, and what the Exodus was really about, we'll have to talk about the Egyptians a lot, including two pharaohs in particular, Ramses II, also known as Ozymandias. He was a character. You know, they had Yul Brynner play him in the Ten Commandments. The real guy may have been even more hard to deal with and authoritative. He was the man. Now, his successor, Ramses III, seems to have accomplished some things through some compromises that his predecessor would not have made, and we'll talk about that. We'll also have to talk about the Canaanites and the Philistines and who they actually were, because it looks like what we came to know as the Israelites were in large part formed from a group of Canaanites. That the division between the Canaanites and the Israelites early on was mostly cultural and political. These were not fundamentally two different ethnicities, even though they had diverged quite dramatically in terms of language and culture and especially religious practices. Okay, so let's talk about the major players and who they were and what they were trying to do, and then what the heck happened. Okay, so let's do a rundown of all the major players on the scene in 1200 BC. It's a very different picture than most people are accustomed to when they think about the ancient world, because, for example, there were no Persians, at least not on the world stage, not making moves. There were no Romans. No one spoke Latin. There are people scattered here and there who spoke a form of an Italic language that's considered to be closely related to Latin, but that's about it. And by the way, the people that spoke that Italic language that's close to Latin are nowhere near Italy. So we know that the Latins, the ethnic group that founded the city of Rome as we know it in the mid-8th century BC, we know that those people were not actually from Italy, and we'll talk about where they might be from. There were also no Greeks, at least not in their Iron Age iteration. There were groups of people in what is now Greece and in what is now Turkey, although back then that was called Anatolia. And then the Aegean Islands, you had people that spoke a precursor of Greek, and you can trace their cultural ideas and their religious practices in particular. It's easy to connect their religious practices with the Greeks of the later Iron Age, but there was no unified Greek identity yet. That's why scholars use 776 BC as a delineation between the world before the Greeks and the world after the Greeks emerged onto the world stage. And the Romans themselves always maintained that they were not from Italy, that their ancestors came from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, in particular, Troy. So it's kind of weird to read the Iliad or the Odyssey and think about the fact that the Romans thought that they were the descendants of the Trojans, that Rome itself was ultimately founded by refugees from the Bronze Age collapse. And of course, one of the most famous refugees of the Bronze Age collapse was Matt Damon, otherwise known as Odysseus. And that brings us to the other ethnic group that we will be focusing on, another group of refugees that wandered and resettled in the decades following the Bronze Age collapse. And that is the Israelites, people who would later become known as the Jews. We'll talk about the Exodus and who were these people. We'll talk about the stories that the Israelites told about themselves. And we'll try to read between the lines and figure out what happened. We'll try to peek into the darkness of the Bronze Age collapse to find out where all these famous Iron Age ethnicities ultimately came from. And real quick, unfortunately, since I don't have any visual aids available, I won't be able to just point at a map. So let's just talk about 4 areas. The first one everyone's familiar with, Egypt. Egypt was the big power. And the interesting thing is, Egypt is basically, geographically, what it is now, except the population was much more concentrated directly along the Nile River and in the Nile Delta. And of course, the population was small by our standards, but enormous by the standards of the time. Egypt was teeming with people. Egypt was lucky because they could grow more excess food than anybody else because the Nile riverbanks and the Nile Delta were so naturally fertile that even with the primitive farming techniques that they had at the time, they could produce a lot of grain. And so we're familiar with Egypt, but let's talk about some of the subdivisions of Egypt. We're going to talk about Northeast Egypt, areas that are to the east, and these are areas that are mentioned in the Bible. One is Goshen, Goshen, and the Bible states that the descendants of Jacob, who was given the name Israel, Israel means he who fights God. And that's an interesting name to be given. His father, Isaac, also had an interesting name. Yitzhak in Old Hebrew means he is laughing, or he laughs. We'll talk a little bit about why those names may be what they are. Also, east of Egypt is, of course, the Sinai Peninsula, which is a major setting in the Exodus story. Then, east of that is Midian, on the northwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. And that's where I think Moses was originally from. I'm going to argue that Moses was not from the same bloodline as the descendants of Jacob or Israel, who settled in Goshen. But that's for a later volume. Let's move on from that area to what I referred to before as the Levant. That word is used a lot in classics, or at least it used to be. But it's kind of an old-fashioned, archaic, medieval term for basically the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. Sailors in Italy, especially from the Venice ports, traded extensively with the eastern Mediterranean, and they kind of lumped it all together. They called it Il Levante, the rising, meaning the rising of the sun. It's interesting that that's sort of a later medieval Italian version of what the Romans would have called the Oriens, which is the rising. Kind of means the same thing. Something that comes from where the rising happens, meaning from the rising sun. The Romans would call that Orientalis. Orientalis, where we get the word Oriental from. The original context of the word Oriental was the classical period, when the Persians were considered Oriental, or even the Egyptians were considered Oriental to the Romans. So, the Levante, or the Levant in English, refers to all those countries on the eastern coasts of the Mediterranean. So we're talking what's now Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, and Egypt. To some extent, Syria, or even Anatolia, which is what's now Turkey, were also considered part of the Levant. But in general, when you think of this, think of what we now consider the Middle East or the Holy Lands. Then the last region that we'll talk about is Mesopotamia. We've all heard of that. Mesopotamia was not the name of an empire or any kind of state-level society. It was strictly a geographic region that contained multiple cities. Mesopotamia was the breeding ground for a lot of later empires still. One of the most famous was Babylon. The Babylonians came from Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia was important not only because of its cultural importance, because it's where civilization started, at least in the West. And if you look at works like Genesis, you'll see that the Garden of Eden appears to be somewhere in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, in Greek, just means the land between the rivers. And of course, that refers to the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Okay, so enough geography, enough about the places. Who are the people that were living there? We're familiar with the Egyptians, and I think we're familiar with what would become the Greeks, what was called Mycenaean civilization. Mycenae would later be pronounced Mycenae, Mycenae, and that was the cultural center of this precursor civilization that gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey, and also the religion that the later Hellenes, or the Greeks, would follow. And of course, it can't be as simple as Mycenaeans referring to themselves as Mycenaeans. They didn't. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, they called themselves all sorts of different names, because there was no unified identity yet. But they refer to themselves in these works as the Achaioi, the Achaeans, Achaeans, or the Danaoi, the Danaans, Danaans. So as you can see, it's a complete mess. It's a linguistic and spelling nightmare, which is probably why I'm interested in it. Now, the Trojans were from around the northwest corner of what's now Turkey, and Troy was a very, very old settlement. We'll talk about Troy and Trojans and where they came from and what have archaeologists found at this site, and does it confirm anything about the Bronze Age collapse? Does it confirm anything that Homer wrote about it? Then we got to talk a lot about these characters called the Philistines, or the Philistines, also known as the Canaanites. These guys are all over the Old Testament, and for good reason. These jokers had the nerve to settle in the Promised Land before the Israelites were even a thing. That's some nerve. And so warrior kings like David had to conquer a lot of Canaanite territory, and there was just a lot of bad feeling all around. But here's the bombshell. Here's the theory that I'm going to champion, and it's the one that says that what we ended up calling the Israelites was actually a new ethnicity that had been stitched together from bands of war prisoners and refugees that were stuck in Egypt, were settled there forcefully as workers. We'll talk about that. And this is what caused the story about the Jews being slaves in Egypt. So these Israelites were partly made up of that group. Then they were partly made up of actual Egyptians who left Egypt with them, led by an Egyptian named Moshe. And then another major part of this ethnicity were displaced Philistines, aka Canaanites. So when David was leading the Israelite armies against the Philistines, these were people that were genetically very, very similar, but separated by wildly different languages and religious practices. We're going to talk a lot about the Canaanite religion and how it seems to match certain names and details in early Judaism. We're going to talk about the names of God, and in particular, where did this Yahweh person come from? Where did the idea of this single warrior God that rules the universe come from? I will argue that something weird did happen in Sinai during what we would call the Exodus, something that altered their religious views or cemented new religious views that had united them before coming out of Egypt. So hopefully that will be interesting. And so as you can see, the political map and the ethnic and linguistic map of the Eastern Mediterranean was very, very different before 1200 BC than it was after. And how different are we talking? Well, as of around 800 BC, we have Israelites taking over Canaanite territories. We have these new people called the Greeks who have realized, oh, hey, we all speak Greek. We all have the same religion and a lot of the same cultural practices. Where the heck did we come from? Then you have the Romans. All of a sudden, in 753, shortly after 800 BC, all of a sudden we've got these Romans draining swamps around these 7 hills in central Italy to build a city. People had been living on those hills since the Paleolithic period. So Rome is not really new at this point in terms of being a center of population. But now an actual city was being planned and built by this united group of people who called themselves Romans. Then, out of the steppes of Central Asia and the highlands of Iran came the Persians. And the Persians were a major player throughout the classical period. We'll talk about the Babylonians. And one thing you'll notice is that we'll talk a lot about Egypt around 1200 BC, but after 800 BC, we're not going to talk about Egypt that much. I mean, we'll talk about what some Egyptian priests told an Athenian named Solon about previous civilizations. The Egyptians appeared to have known that some human civilization had been there before them. So, that's weird. But the reason we're not going to talk about Egypt that much is because after the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt never really recovered. It continued to be very important economically and culturally because of its age and its wealth. Egypt was highly regarded. Now, with the Romans, it was regarded with a lot of suspicion for their decadent Eastern ways and their bizarre superstitions from the Roman point of view. But Egypt was not the military or political powerhouse that it was in the Bronze Age. Now, the last people we need to talk about is the most important group, and it's a group that we call the Sea Peoples. People from the sea. SEA. In other words, at some point around 1200 BC, the coastline of the eastern Mediterranean was attacked. They were attacked by people who came across the Mediterranean, mostly from the west. And like the Vikings, they came in and reduced trade by sea because of severe piracy. They raided and burned coastal towns. And most of this territory was either ruled or protected by Egypt. And so Egypt was the main power to oppose them. And so, thanks to the Egyptians, we have some clues as to who the heck these people were and where they came from. So the problems started right around 1200 BC, and the Egyptians waged a very costly campaign to repel the invaders. And it appears that the last pharaoh of the Bronze Age, Ramses III, successfully defeated a large army of these sea peoples on land in the Nile Delta in 1175 BC. Our source for this comes from an inscription on a monument built in honor of Ramses III's victory over the Sea Peoples. And this monument, luckily for us, actually lists the places of origin, or at least the ethnonyms, or the names of the ethnicities who made up these Sea Peoples. Now, the problem is that these names are written phonetically in the Egyptian language, in hieroglyphics, so we have to do a little bit of intuitive linguistics, i.e., guessing what these names mean, or what we would call these people now. So let's talk about a few of these names. Let's start off with the locals, the people who didn't come from the West, but came from the Levant. These two groups were called, in Egyptian, the Peleset. Peleset. And then the other group was the Denyen. Denyen. The consensus among historians is that the Peleset refers to a people that the Greeks would later call the Pilistinoi, or the Philistines. Philistine in English starts with the letter P, Philistine, but there's a reason for that. It's the very soft Greek P that sounded a little like an F to the Romans, and so they put an H after it to distinguish it from the good, hard Roman P. So the fact that the Egyptians wrote Peleset instead of Philistine makes a lot of sense. The consensus is that the Denyen were the Danaans, those Greek precursor people that I talked about earlier. There was also the Ekwesh, and the idea there is that's referring to the Achaioi, the Achaeans, which was another Greek-ish group. But the most interesting part of this Sea Peoples group came from the west. Well, how far west, you might ask? Well, this monument talks about 3 other groups, the Shekelesh, the Shardana, and the Weshesh. So the Shekelesh, the Shardana, and the Weshesh. So who are these people, according to the best guess of historians? Well, Shekelesh. What does that sound like? Especially since we know that due to Egyptian phonology, if a word started with a pure S sound like si or se, it might still be written she. So what place in the Western Mediterranean sounds like Shekelesh? Or where in the Western Mediterranean are there people who could be called Shekelesh? Well, let's think about the ancient word for an island called Sicily. Sicily used to be called Sicilia. And the Sicels were a group of Indo-European language-speaking people from the east side of Sicily. And even in the Iron Age, as the Sicels were disappearing, moving up to live in the highlands, or intermarrying with the new Greek arrivals. That's why there are no Sicels today. But they definitely were around in 1200 BC, and it looks like they joined a big expedition to go attack the rich eastern countries. So then we have the Shardana. I'll go ahead and not draw out the suspense here, but those are people from Sardinia. And they were known for their piracy in ancient times. But that is a long trip to get on a boat on the coast of the island of Sardinia and then sail past Italy and Sicily all the way over to Egypt. That shows some forward thinking and some determination, and also maybe some hunger and desperation. The third group was called the Weshesh, and it appears that that refers to the Oscans, who were a Celtic group that lived in South Italy at the time. When I went to Pompeii, I tried to read all the graffiti I could, but I got very frustrated. I couldn't figure anything out. Even some writing on a stone stela that appeared to be written with Latin letters, but I couldn't figure out what it said. And later I found out that it was Oscan. And so the Oscans were definitely still around in the classical period. Even when Pompeii was buried under volcanic ash in 79 AD, there were still Oscans speaking Oscan. We may not hear much about them now, but they were kicking around in ancient times, and they apparently caused Egypt a big problem. So these sea peoples were very important because they basically almost simultaneously destroyed every major urban center in the eastern Mediterranean. Anything that was near the coast got pillaged and burned, with very few exceptions. One of them was Athens. There is no giant layer of ash between the ruins of Mycenaean Athens and Iron Age Athens, because it appears that Athens was one of the few city centers that wasn't destroyed. And we'll talk about why that might be. And we will guess about why that gave Athens a huge advantage in the classical period. So, in future volumes of the Bronze Age collapse, we're going to talk a lot more about the Iliad and Matt Damon and his 10-year-long journey to get back home to his wife, Anne Hathaway. And we'll talk about Moses and the Exodus, of course. We'll also talk about some genetic evidence for this stuff. Not every archaeologist is a poor beggar scratching around in the dirt with a garden trowel. No, some archaeology departments actually have a budget. And when they dig up bodies, they can have the DNA extracted and analyzed. And there are some mass graves in the Levant, in what's now Lebanon, that has been excavated, and it reveals some interesting information about the Canaanites and who they were. Let me go ahead and just spoil it. I'm going to argue that what we call the Israelites are actually largely descended from an amalgamated, formless group of refugees, prisoners, the people that lost that battle against Ramses III in 1175. We're going to talk about Egyptian records that talk about the pharaoh forcefully resettling some of these people. This is starting to sound like a few things from the Old Testament. So we'll talk about that. And like I mentioned earlier, we'll also talk about the clues we have that there were previous collapses, much more severe ones. At least we still have some records and oral traditions and memories and major archaeological finds related to the Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age collapse didn't destroy all of our information or memory about the Bronze Age civilizations. In fact, there was a lot of continuity in some areas, especially Egypt, which was not leveled or destroyed. Egypt became much, much weaker over time, but it didn't go anywhere. And it appears that of all the civilizations in the West, Egypt seems to have had the strongest, although still tenuous, connection to what may have happened before the Younger Dryas event. In other words, what humans may have achieved before 10,000 BC. And it seems like the Egyptians had some clue that they were not the first people to build big stone monuments. And so they were kind of wondering, how long have people been around? And why don't we know about these other people from way, way back? You're telling me they didn't write anything down? That's weird. Well, that's it for this episode. It may not be the most exciting episode I've ever done, but hopefully it's a good introduction to what will come later when we start looking at Bible passages and theorizing about what happened on those mountaintops, what kind of bizarre or transformative experiences Moses may have had, and how all of this came together to form most of the major world religions that we see today. And it may have all come down to some mysterious experiences that a bunch of refugees had in the desert. And their new religious belief may have been what kept them together, what united them, and what helped them to survive. And then later thrive under war leaders like Joshua or David. But that's it for this episode. So next week might be aliens, or it might be more Bronze Age stuff. I'm not sure which one people would be interested in more. People might be tired of aliens. So what I'll say is that I'll do aliens if something big comes out, if there's some new information about aliens, if there's another release of information that's not just a bunch of grainy videos. Not too interested in those. But if it's something more substantial, then we'll talk about it. Otherwise, it's more old stuff, more archaeology and old linguistic mysteries. Stuff that I like, but nobody else does. But unfortunately, that's probably what we're going to talk about next week. So until then, talk to you later.